Okay, so this is a tutorial on the muscles of the flexor compartment of the forearm. So just like the upper arm, the muscles of the forearm can be split into anterior and posterior compartments, so flexor and extensor compartments. So the flexor compartment is separated from the extensor compartment by bones, an interosseous membrane and a lateral intermuscular septum. So here I'm just showing you a cross section of the forearm. So this is anterior, posterior, lateral and medial, and you've got the ulnar and radius we're looking at. So in between the radius and ulnar you've got this membrane called the interosseous membrane. So inter meaning between, os Latin for bone, so between the bone membrane, interosseous membrane. Connecting to the radius you've got the lateral intermuscular septum, which connects to the deep fascia which surrounds the muscles of the forearm. So you've got these compartments, the anterior flexor compartment and the posterior extensor compartment. So this interosseous membrane runs between the radius and the ulna in this gap here, separating the anterior and posterior compartments. So the anterior compartment, the flexor compartment, which I'm talking about in this tutorial, the muscles are generally supplied by the median nerve, and these muscles have a common origin on the medial epicondyle of the humerus, so this part here. And if these muscles are overused, then you can get inflammation at this origin, so you get medial epicondylitis, which is also known as golfer's elbow. So the muscles of the anterior compartment flex the wrist and digits and pronate the hand. So pronation is bringing the hand round so that the palm faces away from you, towards you. So in this position here, in the anatomical position, the palm is facing away from you. So pronation would bring the palm to face towards you so that you show the back of the hand. So I'd rotate the hand round. So the muscles of the posterior compartment do the opposite to the anterior compartment muscles. They extend the wrist and digits and they supinate the hands. And they have a common origin on the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. So overuse of the posterior compartment, the extensors of the forearm, you get lateral epicondylitis, which is also known as tennis elbow. So you've got three layers of muscle in the anterior forearm. You've got the superficial layer, the intermediate layer and the deep layer. So I'm just going to talk you through from superficial to deep these muscles. So in the superficial layer you've got four muscles. You've got the flexor carpi ulnaris, the palmaris longus, the flexor carpi radialis and the pronator teres. So I'll just start with this muscle here, which is the palmaris longus. So this muscle, like the rest of the muscles of the anterior compartment, it originates on the medial epicondyle of the humerus and it runs down the length of the forearm to insert into this flat fibrous sheath known as the palmar aponeurosis. So this is a thick layer of deep fascia that lies beneath the skin. So you can see this tendon in yourself. If you flex your wrist, it's quite superficial. You can see that tendon. So what this muscle does, the palmaris longus, is that it flexes the wrist joint. So this palmar aponeurosis actually attaches to the overlying skin of the palm and the fingers. So when you contract the palmaris longus, it flexes the wrist. So medial to the palmaris longus you've got this muscle called the flexor carpi ulnaris. So it's useful to try and think of what the words actually mean. So flexor obviously means it flexes, causes a flexing action at the wrist. Carpi is Latin, carpus means wrist, and ulnaris refers to the ulnar side. So it flexes the wrist at the ulnar side. So this muscle actually has two heads. So I'll just rotate this model around. And you can see one head inserting on the medial epicondyle of the humerus and the other head inserting posteriorly on the ulna and at the olecranon. So it's got two heads, the flexor carpi ulnaris. So what this muscle does is it runs down and it inserts at the wrist down here. So you can, it's not very clear on here, but it inserts on this little bone here, the pisiform bone, and this bone has ligaments which attach to this metacarpal, so this fifth metacarpal bone. So it inserts on this little bone here, and this pisiform bone, which I'll talk about in another tutorial, has ligaments which attach onto this fifth metacarpal. So what this muscle does when it contracts is that it flexes the wrist and adducts the wrist. So just lateral to the palmaris longus, which I just talked about, so this muscle here which attaches to the palmar aponeurosis, you've got the flexor carpi radialis. So remember what I just said about the word carpi, meaning wrist, and looking at the name of the muscle to get an idea of its function and its structure. So flexor flexes at the wrist, carpi, on the radial side. So you can see here it inserts at the medial epicondyle of the humerus, it originates there, and it runs down the forearm to insert onto the metacarpals. So I'll just remove the palmar aponeurosis, and you can see that it has this insertion point at the base. So you've got these metacarpals here, and these phalanges. So these are the metacarpals. So it inserts onto the base of the second and the third metacarpal. And when this muscle contracts, it flexes and adducts the wrist. Abducts the wrist, abducts. So the fourth and final muscle in the superficial layer is this muscle which lies lateral to the flexor carpi radialis. It's the pronator teres. So as the name suggests, it pronates the forearm. So two origins. It originates on the medial epicondyle of the humerus and also on the ulnar bone, and then it inserts onto the lateral part of the midshaft of the radius. So when this muscle contracts, it pronates the forearm. So you've got those four muscles of the superficial layer of the anterior compartment. You've got the flexor carpi radialis and ulnaris, which lie either side of the palmaris longus, and then you've got the pronator teres, which lies lateral. Okay, so now I'm just going to dissect away the superficial muscles, and we'll look at the intermediate muscle layer. So there's one muscle in the intermediate muscle layer, the flexor digitorum superficialis. So the name gives you some idea of its function. So obviously it's a flexor muscle because it's in the anterior compartment. So the word digitorum refers to fingers, so it flexes the fingers. And it's called superficialis because it's superficial to the other muscle which acts to flex the fingers, which I'll show you in a moment. So the flexor digitorum superficialis lies in the intermediate muscle layer of the anterior forearm, and it has two origins. It's got this humero-ulnar origin, and it's got this other origin on the radius bone. Just get rid of that quickly. So it originates on the medial epicondyle of the humerus and also on the ulna, and it also originates on this radial, this oblique line on the radius. It then runs down, and you've got these four tendons which pass through the carpal tunnel. So the carpal tunnel is this space between the flexor retinaculum and the carpal bones, and the median nerve passes through this, and when the contents of the carpal tunnel get compressed, you get muscle weakness and loss of sensation. I'll talk a bit about that in another tutorial. So you've got these four tendons of the flexor digitorum superficialis which run through underneath the flexor retinaculum, and they insert onto the middle phalanx of the index, middle, ring and little fingers. So this tendon is quite interesting because it actually splits and inserts it onto the lateral margins of the middle phalanx, and it allows this other tendon to pass through, so the tendon of the flexor digitorum profundus to pass through. So the tendons of the flexor digitorum superficialis insert onto the middle phalanx, so they split to allow the passage of this flexor digitorum profundus. So an easy way of remembering this is that superficialis splits, profundus passes through, so S superficialis splits, so beginning of the word begins with S, so superficialis splits, profundus passes through. So it inserts on the lateral margins of the middle phalanx. So just to orientate you a bit, you've got the metacarpal bones here, you've got your proximal phalanx, middle phalanx and distal phalanx. So you've got your proximal interphalangeal joint and your distal interphalangeal joint. So the action of the flexor digitorum superficialis is to flex at the proximal interphalangeal joint of the index, middle, ring and little fingers. And it can also flex at this joint, so the metacarpophalangeal joints. So it can flex at the MCP joints and the PIP joints of the first of the index to little fingers. So I'm just going to move on to the next muscle layer, the deep muscle layer. Okay, so I've got rid of the flexor digitorum superficialis, and now we're looking at the flexor digitorum profundus. So this muscle lies underneath the flexor digitorum superficialis, and it originates on the anterior and medial surfaces of the ulnar bone, and it runs down, and again you've got these four tendons which pass through the carpal tunnel underneath the flexor retinaculum, and they run along to insert onto the base of the distal phalanges. So I'll just bring back those other tendons so you can see how they split. You can see the tendon of the flexor digitorum superficialis splitting and the tendon of the flexor digitorum profundus passing through to insert onto the distal phalanx. So you can probably guess that this muscle, when it contracts, it flexes the distal interphalangeal joint. So the flexor digitorum superficialis flexes the proximal interphalangeal joint, and the flexor digitorum profundus flexes the distal interphalangeal joint, and it can also flex the metacarpophalangeal joints, so the MCP joints. Just bring you back up here. So the next muscle is the flexor pollicis longus. So it's this muscle here, which is actually shown a little out of place on this model because it inserts more medially and anteriorly on the radius bone, so more in this sort of region. So this is the flexor pollicis longus. So pollicis refers to the thumb, so we'll go through a lot of other muscles which act on the thumb, and they all have the word pollicis. So pollicis is Latin referring to thumb. So what this muscle does is it flexes the thumb at the interphalangeal joint. So it runs down, it's shown a bit out of place here, it actually runs underneath the flexor retinaculum in the carpal tunnel. So it runs through the carpal tunnel and it inserts on the distal phalanx. So when it contracts, it flexes the thumb at this interphalangeal joint, and it can also flex at the metacarpophalangeal joint. So the final muscle of the deep layer is the pronator quadratus, which lies underneath the tendons of the flexor pollicis longus and the tendons of the flexor digitorum profundus. So from its rectangular shape, so quadratus referring to its four sides. So I've just removed the flexor pollicus longus and the flexor digitorum profundus, and you've got this pronator quadratus. So as the name suggests, it's a pronator muscle, so it pronates the wrist, and it's shown a bit funny here, but I'll just isolate it. So it's actually this rectangular shape. So it originates on this distal anterior surface of the ulna and inserts distally on the anterior surface of the radius, and it contracts. When it contracts, it pronates the forearm. So those are the muscles of the anterior compartment, the flexor compartment of the forearm. You've got the superficial, intermediate and deep layers, and you've got muscles which flex the wrist, which flex the fingers, and which pronate the forearm.